Okay, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis. Yesterday we reviewed till the bottom of page 1194 in volume 2. Those of you that want the text and don't have the book, it's on ayinbeis.com, so you can find the text that we're learning here inside. Now, in the context of B'shamayim imal v'la'aretz metachas, in the verse v'yadai ta'ayim v'shavesa levavecha, about the yichud of Ayin Elikim, that we're talking about discovering the divine within existence and the divine beyond existence. So in other words, Havaya hu Elikim, both in ba'aretz metachas, which is the divine within existence, the Shemayim Emal, divine, the Bligvul, the infinite beyond existence. So the Rebbe Rashab introduced the topic of the dark and the white fire, or the dark and white flame, Eish Shcheira, Eish Levana. And that followed, as I explained yesterday, we began to discuss Eliyahu Hanavi, which is when the twice Havaya Elikim was said. So he's going to tie it all together soon. That Eliyahu came to repair a problem. There was the idolatry and the desecration and destruction of, we call them Mizbeach HaHorus, the defiled or destroyed altar, and Eliyahu came to heal that. So he said the way to reach Er HaBligvul, he said, was Durech Techachas Musar, which is more than just Ner mitzvah v'teira er. The verse says, "Ner mitzvah v'teira er." What's the full verse? Ner mitzvah v'teira er. V'derech chayim techachas musa, and the path of life is through techachas musa, is through rebuke, which means it's through repairing something of the negative. So in explaining that, that's when he introduced Eliyahu, and that's how we got to the white, the dark and white fire, because we're referring to the fire on the Mizbeach of Malchus, which is compared to Isha, Eish Hey, yearning to connect to Eish Yud, Ish. That's Malchus trying to reconnect, which again, of course, is accessing the divine, that the dark flame is connecting to the white flame, or the dark fire to the white fire. But we'll talk about the fires a little later. Just wanted to put it into context. So in doing so, he explained Eish Shcheira, that's the light, the Oyer, that both relates to Shcheira, to darkness, because its purpose is to illuminate the world of the Tzimtzum, the world that was created by the Tzimtzum, the concealed state. And two, it's affected by, and it's an Oyer that travels through the Tzimtzum and the Rishimu in order to create existence. Eish Levana, on the other hand, is the Er HaBligvul, that in both aspects, its purpose is not to illuminate existence, it's to reveal the divine as it is in its pure form, like Lifnei Tzimtzum. And that's the first thing, the purpose. And number two, does not travel through the Tzimtzum. It's impacted by the Tzimtzum, but does not travel through it. What is the impact of the Tzimtzum is what we discussed yesterday more at length. That Nogaba Tzimtzum, he said, means it's impacted that it should not affect the reality, the consciousness created by the Tzimtzum. Like it has to recede into itself. But it itself is exactly as it was before the Tzimtzum. So pre-Tzimtzum, post-Tzimtzum does not affect the intensity and the consciousness of the infinite light being a reflection of the divine. The only difference is the impact on the Cholol. And that's where our Avodah comes, because we want to have an impact. We want that Oyer HaBligvul, which receded, to be reintroduced into existence, which is the V'yadai Ta'ayim V'ashavesa Levecha Ke'avai Elikim B'shamayim Emal. Okay. Now, in this context, where we stopped was at the bottom of page 1194, and that's where I'm going to now refer to text I just posted on the WhatsApp group. So those of you part of the group, you can look at it if you like. For now, I'll just refer to it briefly. I'm not going to elaborate a lot, but you can look at it at your own free time. So the Rebbe Rashab said the following. I just want to put it in context. I think it's very important to see the flow here. It's very back and forth, and it's very brief. So you can miss the point. So he said like this. After giving the example of the sunlight, which I think is also important to reiterate, that the sunlight, Shemesh Hamagan Hashem Elokim, is more like the dark flame, the Ir HaGvul that goes through the Tzimtzum, the Shemesh, Havaya. Shemesh Hamagan Hashem Elokim. Havaya is going through Elokim, the sheath or the shield. And then there's the sun itself, is above. The sun itself is not infected by this, by the Tzimtzum or the concealment that causes the sunlight to shine downward. The sun itself, as he said, is okay. So then he said that in general, Eira Seviv, which for all practical purposes, the transcendent energy is essentially the Eira Blikvul in this context, at least. It's not Lahoyer Asa Elemis, he said. Gilia Atzmus, Ve'ena Misalim. Both things is different in both factors from Eir HaMamala. The immanent energy, its purpose is to radiate and illuminate Ha'elemis, the darkened state pro-Tzimtzum. And it's affected and it flows through the Tzimtzum. Whereas here, the Seviv is not Lahoyer Asa Elemis and Eina Misalim, and it doesn't get concealed within the Cheshach V'Helam HaTzimtzum. But then comes the question, but the Tzimtzum does have impact on it. So that's the key thing, the bottom here, to recognize. That on one hand, we want to know that the Eira Blikvul remains intact, like I said yesterday, because we want to have it in its purest form. We don't want it to be impacted by the Tzimtzum. Eira Mamala, the stream of consciousness that goes from the teacher to the student, absolutely you want it to be subject to the Tzimtzum, because you want it to be the student to be able to understand what the teacher is saying. In the nimshal, in the moral, that means we want to be able to appreciate godliness on our terms, or else we would be annihilated, or we wouldn't have a relationship. So relationship has to be subject to tzimtzum. There, Ablikvul, on the other hand, we want it to be in its purest form. But then the question is, if it would be full glory without any tzimtzum, it would completely overwhelm all of existence. So the answer is, or the explanation I should say is, that on one hand, the tzimtzum affects that it should recede and not impact. On the other hand, the air itself does not get impacted because it remains in its pure form. That's what he said initially, as he explained. He said, "V'ima yes," that through the tzilim nistalik b'nisalim, didn't we say that the tzimtzum has two impacts, and one of them is on the eira blikvul eira seviv, and we said that siluk is that should be b'keich and not poel, which we're going to get back to in a moment. So he said, "Hine b'makamacha." The first explanation that he gave is that elsewhere it's explained that the igul agadol nogabat tzimtzum means, yes, the tzimtzum caused it to be concealed, but not from itself, but from the recipients, basically. And here's where he brings the emek hamelach. But before the emek hamel, the makamacha that he's referring to most likely is samach vav. I mentioned yesterday, at the end of Adam Ki Yakriv. If you look at the image I just posted on WhatsApp, you can see the details. The second one I posted, 2 pages. So you'll see on top it says Samach Vav, page 194 and 195. Or 1 second. Yeah. So if you look at the bottom, he actually brings the same Emek HaMelech, and actually with the corrected chapter. So if you look there, I'll just read a few lines from Samach Vav, because it adds explanation to what we're learning here in Ayin Beis. So if you want to follow, just follow, or just listen to how I'm going to read it. Okay. So he says like this in Samach Vav. You know what? Let me look into the actual book. It's easier for me. This is going to explain a bit more what means Noga B'Hat Tzimtzum. So he says like this. And why I'm focusing on it is because Chassidus, you talk about Tzimtzum, but you don't have a lot about Noga B'Hat Tzimtzum. When you say Noga, you're saying it was touched by the Tzimtzum, but it's not fully affected by the Tzimtzum. So as you can have something, it's like almost saying, I'll use a negative example. It's like when something gets destroyed, so there's collateral damage on the edges that weren't really destroyed completely. So you could say it was affected by the blast or by the explosion, but you can't say it was destroyed by the explosion. I mean, it's a negative example, but just to give an example. So in other words, you could say something that Tzimtzum affected, that Tzimtzum is impacting it in the full sense of the word, or you say Nogabat Tzimtzum, it was touched by the Tzimtzum. It was impacted, but not full in the fullest sense of the word. So this is what he addresses here. So he says, the line I'm reading now, one second, the kav here. I'm reading in the line closer to the bottom. The line begins chulu umavur b'makom acher. So he's going to say something. I'll focus on what we need to focus on. It says umavur b'makom acher the yesh lemer the tzimtzum akavu inyan nogabat tzimtzum. Disregard that for now, because in this mimer he's talking about the kav in a different way than he's discussing it in our mimer here. The main focus I want to put on is what he says afterwards. The lashon zeh. This lashon of Nogabat Tzimtzum, says the Rebbe Rashab, elsewhere, this language is used ala igul hagadol shalifnei hakav. On the igul hagadol. Remember, the igul hagadol is called the large sphere or the large eagle circle that refers to the Eir Ein Sof as it is post Tzimtzum, but it's pre Tzimtzum Eir Ein Sof. So it looks like an eagle agadli. When Eir Ein Sof filled everything in a conscious way, there was no circle because there was no hole. There's no bagel if there's no hole. Everything was just one mass of divine energy, indivisible and omnipresent. So think of a light that's filling up the whole expanse. Then God's koyach hagvul, koyach hatzimtzum comes into play. It removes, so to speak, the habligvul and recedes. So now you can talk about it in the context of an eagle hagadol. Why is it called hagadol? Because it's the sphere that surrounds all of existence. Because everything, all the igulim and the yesher, meaning seviv and mamali. Eagle, by the way, is another word for seviv. Surrounds. In Kabbalah, they use eagle. In Chassidus, they use seviv. Eagle and yesher, igulim and yesher is the Kabbalistic language. Seviv kalam and mamala kalam is from Zohar, but it's more often used in Chassidus. But it's a similar idea. Yesher is a line, the kav. Mamala, there's a hierarchy, a top and a bottom. Eagle, there's no top and no bottom. So the Eagle HaGadol is now in the form of Eagle HaGadol. So he says elsewhere, this language that Nogabat Tzimtzum is used on the Eagle HaGadol. Remember, Samach Vav is written before Ayin Beis. So we're talking about 9-year difference. This was written in Samach Vav, and Ayin Beis this is Ayin Hey. So we're talking about 9 years later. So he says like this. He says, Ki inyan ha-tzimtzum is silika er. Because the tzimtzum itself is the removal, or we'll say the total concealment of the energy, of the light. Shenisal ma'er, that the air was concealed, v'nichlal b'hamoyer, and it was included in the source. So in other words, think of light as being sunlight, and then the sun retracts or recedes back into its source. So moyer here would be lifnei tzimtzum. Okay. So therefore, that's the tzimtzum itself, that it causes the air to be concealed and encompassed in its source. V'nisher mokim ponei, and what remains? An empty space. And what happens to the air? The air remains b'bchinas makif. V'nisher mokim ponei. V'nisher mokim ponei migili air. So now you have space. The teacher has allowed for conceptual space for another, because the revelation of the light has receded into the source. Okay, so that's the tzimtzum in its full impact. That's the impact of the tzimtzum, that the air that was there is no longer there in a gilui way. It's receded into the source. So there you don't say nog about tzimtzum. There you say the tzimtzum is the siluk nesalim. It's completely concealed the air. Aval be'igul hagadol, but the light that remains in the igul hagadol, shalifnei hakav. Now we're talking about before the kav, which enters into this space. The hainu ha'esh and istalik, which means that light that did get that was removed or concealed, finisha b'chinas makif, and now is in a state of makif, because before it was in a state of all-encompassing. We don't call it pnimi necessarily because there's no kalim, but we call it now. It's in a state of makif, meaning somewhat concealed from the space. On this level, the igul hagadol, the statement is only the tzimtzum touched it. It was only touched by the tzimtzum, not concealed by the tzimtzum, meaning concealed within itself. The einay sof sheher bigili b'makom hacholek silikesi kavyachol al atzad. Because when you talk about the einay sof that radiated in the makom hacholol prior to the tzimtzum, that silikesi, that was removed kavyachol, so to speak, al atzad. Shenasa b'chinas igul. It became now an igul, a circle, because it's no longer all over the place. So it's an igul. V'makif. Shekola eru sham v'lo yotza l'chutz klal. All the light is there. So what is the tzimtzum? That it shouldn't go out at all. Like I said with the water, it recedes and it does not affect in a conscious way the space. If that's the case, you can't you can't refer to it that this is a tzimtzum mamish, because the air itself was not diminished. It was just told to remain in its place and not enter the space of the cholol. The tzimtzum who's silika er legamin, because when you say tzimtzum, it means complete removal or complete concealment. The kan hu lehepach. And here by the igul hagadol was not that case, the opposite actually. Shekola er b'shleimus. All the light of the igul hagadol is complete. I'm sorry. The kanu lehepech. Shekola er b'shleimus was shown by igul hagadol. The air is completely intact there in the igul hagadol. Rak noga ba'at tzimtzum. So the only thing you can say is that the noga, that the tzimtzum touched it. Hainu shir rak sham v'lo yizgal l'chutz. So what's the impact? That it should be there and not extend outward, meaning into the space. And look what he says now. Ayin mashakosa be'emek hamelech, shar shashui hamelech peirik nun zayin. That's the same emek hamelech here at the bottom of page 1194. Shar shashui hamelech is shar aleph. In Ayin Beis, he calls it the first gate, but the name of the gate is shashui hamelech. And Perek Nun Zayin, even though he wrote Perek Nun Gimel, but on the bottom they were correct in correcting it because it's chapter 57. So Shar Aleph Perek Nun Zayin is the same as Shar Shashri HaMelech Perek Nun Zayin, but he adds one more sefer. Sefer Shari Gan Eden. This is a sefer that's very not often brought in Chassidus. It's actually from one of the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov. His name was Shari Gan Eden. What was the name of the Shari Gan Eden? His name was, it's a famous name, Koppel, Yaakov Koppel, I think. Yeah, I have the sefer here somewhere. Al Kapanim, he zeichens now also Shari Gan Eden be'inyan zeh. He says, just look there in this subject matter. V'zeu shenikra noga ba'at tzimtzum. And this is the meaning of noga ba'at tzimtzum. Now, he continues on to talk about the kav. I'm going to stop here because it's not relevant to our discussion in this mimer. But what do you see here? You see much more elaboration on the topic we just touched upon. That's why I wanted to see it in Ayin Beis. As far as Emek HaMelech goes, There's no real need to study it because Emek HaMelech is very Kabbalistic and dense, but I did post it. So if you want to look through it, you could see there. It talks about the 3 Tzimtzumim, all within the Igul HaGadol, and there he does address the issue of Nagaba Tzimtzum. But we just learned it in the language of Chassidus. It's a lot easier. You can go back there, feel free. I don't think I need to do that. It's fine with what we have. But suffice it to say that in Emek HaMelech, he talks about 3 different impacts, how the Tzimtzum has on the Makif, on the Mukaf, and what's in between. In this, when the Tzimtzum happened, what happens in the process of how the Tzimtzum impact that level of energy. Now, I will say, if I may, you may recall that at the bottom of page 1192, I didn't forget, there was a line there that I said we'd go back to, because I didn't want to go into it, because I wanted to see what the Rebbe Rashab is going to develop here. So if you remember the line where in the parentheses, where he compared, he said, he talked about that darkness precedes light, both the Tzimtzum comes before the Kav, but he also said that the Eir, before the Tzimtzum, also has an element of darkness, of a levush, ana emlech, machshava v'ana emlech. Eita Eir kesalma, that he wraps himself with light like a shirt, like a garment. So, if you remember there in the parentheses, he spoke about that before the Tzimtzum, you also have such a levush. And he explains the difference is that the garment, that the Tzimtzum as a garment, as a levush, is like a garment that covers the body, like a true helm. The levush ha-machshava v'anoemlech, he said there, is a helm sheyesh beigili. In other words, it's a concealment, but it also has revelation. I do think that some of what we're learning here is connected to that. I don't want to right now go into in detail, but I will after we finish the whole subject, because I think it'll be very distracting. But the reason I'm mentioning it because it's connected, because the Emek HaMelech, which the Rebbe Rashab is citing here, does talk about that when the Tzimtzum happened, the Tzimtzum also created a type of a garment. And the Igul HaGadol is what maintains that the garment is like parchment upon which the letters are written. So when we're talking about letters, we're talking about the letters of the Asar Mamoris as they are in their root, the Eisis Harashimu. So it could be that he's referring, that's why he mentioned this garment, that the garment is the letters as they are pre-Tzimtzum. And that's where there's also it's still a garment, but it's not a garment that is complete concealment. And then the Tzimtzum is a concealer. That's why you have Erev and Beker, Bereisha Chashecha Hadar Nehura, first darkness, then light. But subtly, there's also a form of that before the Tzimtzum. So it could be he's referring to the Igul HaGadol and the Nogaba Tzimtzum, maybe not. I'm not saying definitely, I just wanted to point it out. If this is confusing anyone, then just leave it be. I'll go back to it when we are finished the subject, because I don't want to stop the flow of what we're learning right now. Just wanted to point it out in the context of the Emek HaMelech.
The Reshimu is
all touching.
Mokim, the Cholol or Mokim Ponoi, right? The Reshimu is after Mokim Cholol Ponoi. Cholol or Mokim Ponoi.
Generally speaking, it goes like this. The Tzimtzum and the Shimu usually go in hand, because the Shimu is a product of the Tzimtzum. But the point is that if you break it down, it goes like this. The Tzimtzum is concealment of the Oyer. The Shimu is the residue or the trace or impression that remains. Now, I discussed at length the Shimu, and Rabbi Yitzchak, of course, documented it. So I refer you to that if you really want to understand the Rishimu. But the Rishimu is a concealed state that remains after the Tzimtzum. And by the way, in Rishimu we say Loi Noga B'hem HaTzimtzum. So here's an interesting twist. That the Rishimu, the Igul HaGadol, the Tzimtzum did impact at least that it shouldn't radiate in the Cholol, in the space. And the Esis Arashima loy noga b'mat Tzimtzum, because they remain intact. However, they're in a state of concealment. So this is another discussion. What does it mean that they're intact if they're in a state of concealment? But the point being is that the reason is because that's where their inyan is to be concealed. That's kalim or asius. And later they will be revealed through the kav that will bring them alive, so to speak. Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you answered the question. The Reshimu Loi Noga Boya Tzimtzum, you discussed that, and like you said, the Rabbi documented. Otherwise, it's hard to understand.
Okay, so now let's continue on. What's the next piece here? The next piece goes like this. So we finished with Nogabat Tzimtzum. I'm reading 4 lines from the bottom of 1194. But now the Rebbe Rashab is going back to what he said before. That's according to Muvur B'Mokemacha, the Samach Vav, that Nogabat Tzimtzum. So we have an understanding, a reconciliation between both statements. That on one hand, Eir HaSeviv is not concealed by the Tzimtzum. On the other hand, it's impacted by the Tzimtzum. Remember, he said before that it's Lamaila, the Lashon was Ein Misalim Chinuch Cheshev V'Helam HaTzimtzum, but V'ima Yesha Dei Tzimtzum Nistalig V'Nisalim Ha'er. So the first way of explaining it is with the Nogabat Tzimtzum idea. That the Igul Agadol is affected by the Tzimtzum, but it does not impact the Cholol. So that's the first explanation. Now he's going to go and back to the discussion based on the Maimer Vayikra. What happens to the Oir, the Igul Agadol, when the Tzimtzum caused it to recede? So he said, so now he's giving a second explanation in this topic, which makes it even stronger, the case that the Igul Agadol is not impacted by the Tzimtzum. To me, it sounds a bit, even though he doesn't say it explicitly, that the Ach, by saying Ach, he's saying 2 things. That I'm giving you now another explanation. After he said, Hine b'mokem achem avur. So Hine b'mokem achem avur is like one explanation, that the Igul Agadol was touched by the Tzimtzum, but the Eir itself was not affected, but it's only affecting that it shouldn't impact the post-Tzimtzum space. Now he's saying, Ach, gam lefish mashon is barlel. Also, according to what we learned earlier, and to me it sounds like he's saying, according to this, that maybe the Igul Agadol, not even according to this, the Tzimtzum didn't even have a noga by Tzimtzum. Now he doesn't say it explicitly, but let's read and you'll see from what he says. It sounds to me that this is even deeper than what he says till now. So let's read this now. And the Nizbar Le'il is referring to 5 lines earlier,
1193.
What?
Which page are you now?
The bottom of 1194. Aleph Kuf Tzadik Daled. So if you see, when Nizbar Le'il Dibra Maschel Vayikra, that's what he's referring to now. He says, according to what we learned earlier, where we say that the Igul Hagadol went into a state of koyach and Yecholes. So there you could hypothetically argue the opposite, that according to the explanation that the Igul Hagadol was not affected by the Tzimtzum in the sense, it remains in the teacher's mind, so to speak. or in the pre-Tzimtzum state, and its only effect is that it's not shining outside of that space, meaning into the space of the student, or into the space of the cholol of existence. So there, clear, Eira Seviv is not affected by the Tzimtzum, only in the context that it doesn't shine in a conscious way to the recipient. That's Nagabat Tzimtzum.
Just a geographic
itself,
distribution it affects, nothing else.
So
to speak.
What's that? But the Eir itself remains intact. But according to what we learned in the Maimer of Vayikra, you could argue, one second, there the Eir went back into a state of potential and capacity. So it's not like an Eir that remained conscious in its own state. Imagine the water not just receding back to the ocean and leaving space for land, but imagine it all going back into a state of potential. So then you could argue that we don't have access to it because it's no longer in a state of Eir even. It's in a state of Koyach and Yecholes. So he's going to say that's not the case. What did you want to say? I didn't hear you.
I was just saying, I was just mentioning, apropos to what you were saying, it's like a geographic potential, but then there's the concept, what you just said now, of the difference between dry land and water. He called it mud in another mimer, like it always has a potential to wet you. It's
okay. Well, let's see. Well, let's read on. According to what we learned before, that the Eir goes into a state of koyach, what he called also Yecholes, which is even more than koyach. That's not a weakness. That's not a diminishment of the Eir. In other words, when you say Tzimtzum, a Tzimtzum that conceals something. So that Tzimtzum is more powerful than the revelation. So it's definitely compromising and concealing that light. But that's only a light that relates to the space. If you're talking about the Eir Habligvul or the Eir HaSeviv, and you're saying that it goes into a state of potential, koyach, or capacity, Yecholes, he's saying that's not a weakness, that's not a diminishment. It's actually a ilui ba'ir. Mashanisha b'keyach, dahainu b'chinis Yecholes levad. It's actually an ilui, a superior quality in the Eir that's in the state of koyach, which means in the state of only Yecholes alone, the capacity. Now, we have to understand what that means. But pashtus, what it means is because you're dealing here with God's power. What is stronger? The light that comes from God that's revealed in an actual way, or the power of God to give off such light? So when it comes to a human being, you could argue if he doesn't give off the light, just he has the power to do so, it's still diminished. Why? Because if I said to you, I have the ability to be the greatest scholar on earth, or I have the ability to throw a stone 10 miles, that's a very nice statement. But until I do it, it's only a potential thing and it's not even reality. Lamaila, you could argue, God is not diminished by the fact that it wasn't actualized. He doesn't need actual light. So you could argue the opposite. The more it is in God's potential and capacity, the greater the light is. Because in the source, it's always greater than it is when it comes into actuality. By us is the opposite. Even though our potential is always more than our actualization, but potential without actualization is not real in this world. If I said to you, I potentially love you, but I never express it, and I never give, and I never do anything to demonstrate. If Jews said, I'm a good Jew at heart, but you never act on it, that's a chasad. That's not considered a maila. La maila, you could say the opposite. Since God, the etzem, is beyond everything, so the fact that he has the capacity to give light, and the Yecholes is much stronger because it's on the level of atzmus than the actual light. So what the Tzimtzum actually did for the Oyer Haseviv, which recedes back into the source, into the state of Kayach and Yecholes, actually gives the Oyer more power. Not in the world of revelation, but in the world of Etzem. That's how I would explain this line, unless I have to go back to Vayikra and understand it differently. But he doesn't say what I'm saying. I just want you to tell you this is my explanation of it. I'm not sure 100% that I'm correct. I need to qualify what I'm saying. But it sounds like that.
Is this like al derech koyach de hetera adif, or like a mashal? It gives and brings in Chassidus sometimes of a father that loves his son. He's going to withhold his love when the child wants a knife, but that's showing on a stronger love, because you're able to withhold that emotion and give it when the child is.
It's a good example, but I would use that example more in the power of Tzimtzum than the power of the Oyer going back to Yecholes. What you just said is the power of God to restrain his revelation by concealing. The power to conceal is stronger than the power to reveal. What you said, I would use that for that. That Koyach HaTzimtzum reveals a deeper, but it's like the restraint of a wise person who wants to say something and controls himself comes from deeper strength than saying what he wants to say. The exercising restraint. Here he's not talking about restraint. Here he's talking about the Oyer, when it goes to the state of Yecholes, is just a higher quality level of divine energy, divine being. That's where I would say.
Can you say you need a higher to be able to practice restraint?
We're not talking about that now. Here he's discussing what happens to the Haseviv after the Tzimtzum. What you said is a good explanation for the power of Tzimtzum is the power of restraint. That is a very deep power because it's even deeper than the power of revelation. But he's not talking about the power of restraint now. He's talking about the power, what happens to the Oyer when it goes into the state of Koyach and Yecholes.
Okay.
I do want to look quickly at page and Vayikra for a moment to make sure that I'm not going off track here altogether. Just give me a minute. Let me see something. Did anyone study the Maimer of Vayikra on this topic or not?
What's the page in Vayikra?
I'm looking at it. Do you have the Sefer with you? I'm looking at it right now. The page, if I recall correctly, I think it was 915. Tov Kuf Tazvav. וגם לגבי עצמי, המסלמה שהער במוער, ושני שם חזקאל בפעל. One minute. I have to correct myself. I want to see how much. Okay. I stand more or less by what I said. It's more or less correct. But here's what I want to add. In Vayikra, he doesn't really talk about the Maila, the quality of the Oyer going back into a state of Koyach and Yecholes. He talks more there about the fact that it's as if it doesn't exist, like the Ki'iloi Einoi that he's using here. That, in other words, it's only a state of potential. And he explains it at length what that means there. So here, however, he's focusing on the quality of it. Now, another thing, there in Vayikra, he says it's not like Ein Koyach Chaser Peil. So what I said before, I would rephrase a bit. Not so much in the Havana and understanding, just in the wording. Since he says it's not Ein Koyach Chaser Peil, I would say more like this. He says like this, that the idea that the light goes back into its source is B'Koyach. He says it's not Ein Koyach Chaser Peil. That's why he says it's more like Yecholes. It's Yecholes. It goes into the state of the Yecholes that God has the capacity to give light. So in other words, the Tzimtzum's effect is that instead of having conscious energy, divine, infinite, transcendent, save of energy present, is going into the capacity for such an energy. So that's what he says there. It's not koyach as in potential, but koyach as in capacity. So therefore, what I said I think is the explanation. As I said, he doesn't say the details. He just says it's a ilui ba'ir, which means that it's not impacting the oir in a negative way. Because the point he wants to make in this mimer, which is this is the only thing that's relevant to us, does the Tzimtzum impact the oir habligvul in any negative way? And the answer is no. According to the first explanation, because Nagabat Tzimtzum is only Nagabat Tzimtzum, the oir remains in full intensity. However, it's not the Tzimtzum's impact is only that it shouldn't shine and illuminate in a conscious way into the space created by the Tzimtzum. And according to the explanation in Vayikra, the oir may not be in existence. So you could say, okay, so then it's diminished. No, he says on the contrary, it's going to ilui, because it's now in a state of Yecholes ha'atzmus. That's essentially what he's saying here. These two explanations.
Is there a difference between Yecholes and
what's that?
koyach? I mean, if you have one, don't you have the other?
Can you just hold on a second? I want to add something. The question is, before I take any questions, I want to say, so what's the difference between these two explanations? Yesterday I explained that the reason we want to say that the oir habligvul remains intact is because we want to have ultimately through our avodah, v'yadaita ayim, we want to have an experience of infinite divine, unadulterated, undiluted, untouched. So the Igla Gadol is exactly that. It's untouched air. It's just not accessible to us in the beginning of the process because the student needs to be able to learn, needs to be able to exist. But when we are able to reach there at, let's say, age 40, like you said earlier, then you have the whole package of Igla Gadol untouched, untainted. According to the Lefimash Bar Le'il, it gets even more interesting. Because the mila of Igla Gadol is that at least it's an oir, so it means it's present. In the explanation that it goes into the state of Yecholes, the chsaron of that is, well, I don't want to say chsaron because it's not correct. I'm saying it only in context of these two explanations, is that it's not a conscious oir at this point. It's higher than conscious. It goes like into the unconscious of the divine, the Yecholes ha'atzmos. So the mila of that is that we're not only getting Blig Vul, as it's in a conscious state, undiluted, because it was not, the Tzimtzum didn't affect it. But we're also getting the Yecholes of God in the Blig Vul when we do our Avodah. That would be the difference between these two explanations. Now, that's, of course, a pretty deep concept, which needs further explanation, but I just wanted to say that before we continue. Go ahead now.
I just want to...
One at a time.
Yecholes, it seems like when you have Yecholes, you always have koyach. When you have koyach, you always have Yecholes. I mean, what do you use in a different context? I don't understand maybe the Hebrew. I don't know.
Yecholes is the word. Tzemach Tzedek says that the Alter Rebbe was mechadish the concept of Yecholes. It means because in Atzmus, you don't want to identify any definition in Atzmus. When you say someone has a koyach, let's say we have the koyach haseichel, koyach hariyah, the power to see, the power to write. Koyach, even though it's not actual yet, but it's still closer to actual. In Atzmus, you never want to say the word koyach because it's creating too much definition within Atzmus. So the Alter Rebbe, in trying to understand the bridge between Atzmus and anything that comes out of Atzmus, uses the word Yecholes. It's simply a word to describe something that's not even in a state of potential versus actual. It's just God's capacity to do anything he wants. So it's like we learned earlier about Ein Sof. There's Ein Sof as infinity. There's Ein Sof as saying he's not limited by any definition, not by infinity, not by finite. So when you say infinity, that's a koyach. Koyach Ein Sof, koyach bli gvul, koyach gvul. When you say Yecholes, you're saying it's completely an atzmusdika level. Atzmus's capacity to do whatever he wants to do. So you say the koyach lahayir, Yecholes lahayir is not the same. In Hebrew, in simple Hebrew language, maybe people wouldn't distinguish. But in language of Chassidus, Yecholes is speaking about things as close as possible within Atzmus, but as Atzmus's capacity to do something. Whereas Koyach would make God basically made up of parts or made up of koyches, of faculties, and you can't say that. That's the key difference between Koyach and Yecholes.
Good explanation, Koyach.
May I ask on Saf Saf Kuf Tesvav, it says it's not the Torah of Yehovah's Mamish of Atzmus. You only use it seems to you only use as a dimyon.
Right. That's a good point. I made that point when we learned it the first time. So you have to say there's two levels in Yecholes. In other words, there's Yecholes within Atzmus Mamish and Yecholes, so to speak, in Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, outside of Atzmus, but Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's how I would understand it.
It seemed like he's trying to avoid the difficulty of Koach isn't Hatsupoyo. That's until he uses the word Yehovah's.
Yeah, but I think what he says there are three levels. There's Yecholes HaAtzmus, which we're not discussing. There's Yecholes that's not Koyach, and then there's Koyach and Poyol. And he wants to say that the Koyach, that the Tzimtzum caused the Eir Abligvuls to go into a state of Koyach, means Yecholes, the second meaning, the second level of Yecholes. That's what he says there.
Yeah.
Even though that Yecholes means Yecholes, you cannot divide in Yecholes because Yecholes.
Well, he does. He divides it on page Tov Kuf Tu says Vav. He does divide it. He says clearly, it's not that Yecholes. He says two levels in Yecholes for sure. It says it's Yecholes, but not Yecholes Mamish. That's what he says there. I could explain it if you want me to. You want me to explain it?
Yeah, please.
We've talked about this a number of times. We have to go back a step. The problem is I wanted to finish the sentence here. Okay, fine. You know what? Let me say this. Remember, I always point out, I don't like this to be mathematical or physics. This isn't a mechanical thing here. It's not like parts. Yecholes is here, another Yecholes is here, and Koyach is here, and Koyach Chaser Poel is here, and Poel is here. You have to understand it conceptually. What I mean by that is we're trying to have an understanding in something that is beyond any definition. And then that Atzmus, built in Metzias Nimtza, Metzias Atzmus say, Mechuyev HaMetzias, these highest levels, and then creates a structure which is determined, that's an indeterministic and beyond indeterminism. And then creates a deterministic structure of Bligvul and Vul and Eir and Tzimtzum and Igul and Kav and all the levels we're talking about. So how do we wrap our head around this? So one of the ways to do so is through mipsari echza elaka. From my flesh I behold God. And that is to look at, and that's why we find Chassidus so often the example of the nefesh. When a person, God forbid, a corpse, can't do anything. There's no neshama in the guf, so you have a limp, dead body. Rahman al-Islam. I'm saying it for a reason, you'll see in a moment. When the neshama is in the body, what do you have? A living entity. What does a living entity mean? Not only is the body alive and can breathe and walk and so on, but the body also has faculties. The eyes could see, the ears could hear, the mouth could speak, the mind can conceive, the heart feels. So it's a whole. How do you explain the pshitus hanefesh, the nefesh in its purest form as a indivisible soul, which we know is not made up of parts? The soul is a divine energy. Poshet. How does that nefesh, that's poshet, completely shapeless, suddenly giving energy of all kinds of faculties inside of us? So that's why Chassidus goes through an elaborate scheme, an elaborate structure and process, how you get from nefesh all the way to right now me moving my index finger, which is a big jump. And how do you do that? And with that, you can go back and then explain how, at least to some extent, understand how from pshitus ha'atzmus you get into a structured reality. So how does Chassidus explain it? So I've enumerated a whole bunch of levels, and I'll say them right now. I'm going to go from the bottom up. Go either way. So we know there's Yechida, Chaya, Neshama, Ruach, Nefesh, or Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. But even furthermore, let's talk about faculties. So there's the Koiches HaNefesh HaGluyim, revealed faculties. I'm right now moving my hand. I'm moving my index finger. That's a faculty. Without a nefesh, it's just a dead corpse. Nothing moves. With a nefesh, you have a koyach goli. Now we all know, what about when I'm holding my finger like this and I'm not moving it? So you can't say it doesn't have the power to move because I can move it any second. So we call that the koyach nelam. So koyches nelamim. So there we have two levels. Koyches gluyim is the actual revealed, actualized faculties. Koyches nelamim is concealed, but it's just a step away from revelation. I can throw a stone, let's say 100 feet. I have the power to do so. I can write thousands of books. That's koyach hanelam. When I actually write one, that's koyach hagoli. But what's behind the scenes of koyches nelamim? There comes the next level. It's called koyches hiyulim. Potential. What's the difference in koyach hiyulim and koyach nelam? Koyach nelam means I've developed. It's just a matter of using it. Koyach hiyuli could be without exercise. My muscles can only go that far. Koyach hiyuli is more in a potential state, but it's not gilui, it's not helam close to gilui. It's more helam that's more distant from gilui. Then there's koyches atzmim, so fourth level, atzmim. The atzm is the koyches, and we're still not talking about the nefesh yet. Then there's koyches haklulim benefesh, how these faculties are encompassed in the nefesh. Then there's nefesh.
Higher than atzmim.
Koyches atzmim.
The klulim
I already moved to koyches haklulim benefesh. I'm not going to go through an explanation of each one right now.
I understand, but this is higher than atzmim.
Of course, yeah. Koyches atzmim means deeper than hiyuli, but it's still a koyach. It's like you say the aish. Like okay. Then comes koyches haklulim benefesh, and even that's not the deepest yet, because there it's still talking about the koyches as they're encompassed in the nefesh. Then comes the next one would be nefesh neise koyches. The nefesh carries the Yecholes for koyches. So what is Yecholes in the nefesh? On one hand, it's nafshizdik and not shaped by anything. On the other hand, it's already the capacity that will lead to the keiches haklulim b'nefesh, that will lead to the keiches atzmim, keiches nalomim, hayulim, nalomim, and gluyim. Now, this is just to give a little taste of how something begins in a state of utter, a nebulous, I would say, like almost an amorphous, unshaped state, and then has the capacity to do something. But it's not yet, you can't even call it a specific koyach atzmi or a koyach kolol even. So my point that I'm trying to say here is that when you start breaking it down like this, you can break Yecholes into parts as well. You could say Yecholes ha'atzmus, how atzmus is capable of doing anything. You could say Yecholes ha'atzmus to give off Eir HaBligvul, but it's right now in a state of Yecholes, not in a state of koyach or poil, which is what he's saying in Vayikra. That's a brief explanation, not a lengthy one, but brief. What you have to do is figure out and see that these are all like potential states. You know, I've talked about this in a different context. We know that when the conception of a child, of a new life, so the egg is fertilized by the seed, but the Eibishter gives a neshama. Now, when the conception happens, there's only one cell. If you look at the cell, it's not even keiches klulim yet. It's a cell that has the capacity that will then develop. What about the moment before conception, when God is envisioning what type of neshama he's going to send to this person, to this body? So you see here how many levels you can create here, even in pregnancy itself, from one cell to a full-bodied child. And then that one cell as it's in God's vision, and how that vision is pre-Tzimtzum. The truth is, to learn this properly, as I said, is only through Avodah. To find the Avodah where you stand in each of these levels. Most of us function on a very poyel-dika level, koiches gluyim, how godliness is manifest in the Ayin of the Yesham Nivra in a very tangible way. He's talking here in the highest levels it goes even deeper than this. So you're talking about relating to existence, how God looks at existence, how God's capacity looks at existence. And the truth is, if I did it right, we'd have to go very slowly and explain each level what that means in Aveda, because they're very different. You remember the letter I quoted from the Rebbe, the difference, for example, between the Eved Poshet, that who doesn't, but for him, it makes no difference what Hashem tells him to do. Everything is equalized because it's all part of Ratzon Hashem. And then there's the specifics where when you eat matzah, you're not putting on tefillin. Each one has its own particular hamshacha. So in Aveda, all these levels depends how deep you're going to the elikus in it, or how low you're going into the structure of it. And the interface of Ayin Beis is meant to bring them both together. So that's really what it comes down to, is where you stand in the context of all of this. In other words, are we focusing on a structure, or are we focusing on God's capacity to create that structure, or something in between? Now remember, even the Kav, after the Tzimtzum, is also a very abstract level. It's not like a ray of light, like sunlight. It's also abstract. Compared to us, the Kav could be even a state of Yecholes, to be honest. So if you really want to really break it down, Yecholes is a word that can be defined. Atzilus could be Yecholes compared to our level. See what I'm saying? So it's not semantics. It's about understanding what level you're talking about, how much of a godliness and how much of structure and how they come together.
It's like a continuum almost.
Yeah. So when you say that we have access to Eir HaBligvul, what it really means is, first we have to go through our structure system before we get there. But we still have access. That's why the Rebbe always says, everybody can do Mesiras Nefesh. Everybody has B'chol Ma'oitcha. Right now, you have Bligvul in your capacity, in your ability to do so. Anyway, a lot more to be said on this. I hope this was helpful.
What does it mean כאשר מאיר האור, הרי הוא בבחינס גילוי ממש בלי שום הסעלמוס כלל?
Well, because of the questions you asked, we never got to that line. We'll have to do that tomorrow.
Oh.
I'm going to explain it tomorrow. It's not a minute explanation. It's the whole flow of this whole discussion. You'll soon see. I'll explain it tomorrow. So let's
Okay.
stop here.
One
A little
more
more
question.
review. Bottom of 1190.